Alrighty, well, welcome to Artemis Agile Consulting's Tales from the Trenches, Transforming Teams to Kanban and Scrumban. This is a presentation I gave at Mile High Agile 2015 on April 3rd. So for those of you who were present, here's an opportunity to actually get to see the presentation and share it with your teams if you'd like, without having to figure out what I said during each of the slides. For those of you who are experiencing this for the first time, weren't able to attend the session, then I'm hoping you're going to enjoy it. So, uh, this is a Tales from the Trenches, which is actually a moniker I use for those presentations I give that are actually sort of case studies. So, this is something that I actually did with a team. Had a lot of support from other people in the organization and on the team to do this, but we actually transformed a team to a Scrumban approach using our Kanban principles, and here we go. So I really debated calling this presentation Team White, Gold, and Team Blue, Black, who's right and who's really, really wrong. The idea here being really that Scrum and Scrumban are simply agile methodologies. Sometimes what you need is a Scrum approach. Sometimes what you need is a Scrumban approach. Depends on your team and really depends on what your team is capable of and how they succeed with each individual thing. So whether you see the dress as white and gold or whether you see the dress as blue and black, there's no right answer here. The color of the dress is really irrelevant. And what really matters here is your perspective, where your team is coming from, what kind of lens do they look at their process through and their project, and is that seen as white and gold or blue and black? So who am I? I am Bill DeVoe. I own Artemis Agile Consulting, 15-year, a little more than now, veteran of Agile. I've been doing it since I started at a company called Anarch in Boulder, and we adopted Agile based off extreme programming. And then about 5 years ago, I began my Scrum experience officially, and I got my certified Scrum Master, product owner, and then became a certified Scrum professional. I have worked at several different companies on the Front Range, primarily in Colorado, including Hewlett Packard, HID, Global, EchoStar. Yeah, I even did a stint at EchoStar and at Comcast. And in all of these places, either I started working on adopting Agile for those environments or was participating actually in an Agile adoption that was in progress. So I was very fortunate that in most of these locations that I was able to create Agile processes that would help my team succeed. And most recently at Comcast, which I left to start Artemis, I was actually part of an Agile PMO whose responsibility really was to help the development organization adopt Agile, Scrum specifically. But then also, as we began growing our organization, we began looking at other opportunities, and Scrumban became one of the choice methodologies to apply for some of our teams. And the team that I did this with actually benefited greatly from doing that. So first things first, during our presentation, I asked, who had some Scrum experience and Kanban experience, and then also who had Scrumban or had actually using Scrumban. Regardless of where you are with your familiarity, I am going to go over Scrum a little bit and then talk about Kanban. Kanban's a little less well known than Scrum is in the Agile community. And then I'll get into Scrumban, what it is, and then we'll talk about the actual case study of Team Porlock. So what is the Scrum process? Well, the Scrum process is pretty basic. Starting off with a product vision, and the idea here is you have a product owner who's responsible for taking a product vision and turning it into a product backlog via these product backlog items, these PBIs. Traditionally, Scrum doesn't differentiate between a PBI and a work item and a user story, but user stories are very commonly the way that people represent these product backlog items. So if I use story, then I'm actually talking about a PBI or a work item. They're all the same thing. We take a product backlog, which is our vision that's been decomposed into these items that the team can work on, and then we create a sprint backlog. And that sprint backlog is the set of work the team commits to for the duration of the sprint, and they try to get that work done. We do our sprint work over the course of 2 to 4 weeks. Generally, personally, I focus on the 2 week side of it. I think that generally works out better. When I originally adopted Scrum, or originally adopted Agile rather, at Anarch, our methodology allowed us to go between 1 and 3 week sprints, depending on the amount of work that we had to do and what else is going on with the product. But typically, I've focused on doing 2 week cadences. There's a lot of benefit in doing that for the reasons of retrospectives and some of the other meetings that we have as part of sprints, and then also just the fact that 2 weeks is a good chunk of time for developers to work within. Then we have our daily work, and that, of course, occurs every 24 hours. But we take a small chunk of work and we work on it, and then we recommit to doing the work from the sprint every 24 hours. The stand up is really sort of a fractal of the sprint planning. One of my coworkers is very keen on saying that, and I agree with him very strongly. We need to really focus on, when you're answering the 3 questions in Scrum during stand up of what did you do yesterday, what are you doing today, and are you blocked by anything? That what did you do yesterday? It becomes a checkpoint for the team to say, hey, wait a second, you've had this in progress for a couple of days now, what's going on? And we also have the opportunity for committing to new work. I will be getting this done today, so tomorrow, if that's not done, then I might be asking some questions about that. At the end of all of this, the end of the sprint, we try to produce a product increment, and this allows us to deliver value to a customer. Sometimes it is something that's shippable, sometimes it's not, but always we're focusing on the value that we're going to be delivering to the customer. So when we talk about Scrum metrics, there's 2 primary things that we look at. The first is a burn down chart, and the second is a burn up chart. The burn down chart is the number of hours that remain after you've tasked out the work items. You track the number of hours, and your team updates every day, like they're supposed to. And at the end of it, you end up with 0 points, 0 hours remaining at the end of your sprint. Your burn up chart tracks the number of work item story points or work item points that have been accepted by your product owner. So you see it starts off a little slow, nothing in day 1 or day 2, but then we start having some small stories accepted, and we begin building up, and by the end of it, we've completed all of the work and it's all been accepted and everybody's happy. In reality, though, what you're probably going to see is something more like this, which is that your burn down chart will stay unchanged for about 5 days, and then you'll remind your team, hey guys, I need you to update your hours, and then they'll do it for a day, and then they'll forget. And then every day thereafter, you're going to have to hound them to be keeping and updating their hours, but of course they'll do it at the beginning of the next day, right before stand-up, so at the end of the sprint, you're actually going to have about some certain number of hours that are not yet accounted for that are part of your sprint. And your burn up chart, almost everything will be in progress and nothing will actually get accepted until the last day when there's a big push to get your product owner down with your team and you're going through all the stories and you accept everything all at one fell swoop. It's also called the hockey stick for obvious reasons. So what is Kanban? Well, when we talk about Kanban, we talk about it's based upon lean manufacturing principles. And so what are those principles? And those principles here are starting with where you are. Kanban doesn't want you to take a look at your end state. It wants you to start off with where are you today and use that as your baseline. You are where you are for a reason. So use that as your baseline, and then you can begin to make incremental changes. When we talk about making those changes, we want to make them small, incremental, iterative, evolutionary changes. You want to take a small change, see how that's impacted, look at your metrics, and find out, is this helping us or is this not helping us? And then, either, pivot or persevere, continue making changes and try to figure out, well, if that didn't work, what will work, and then try to figure out how to move forward beyond that. Also, you have people. Those people have roles. They have responsibilities. They have titles. So Kanban recommends that we respect the titles, responsibilities, and roles that we have. Again, we have them for a reason. People associate very closely with their role and responsibility. So start off with those and respect the people that are in those roles and the roles and principles that are there. We expect that we're going to have leaders at the top and at the middle of our organization, but Kanban really encourages us to have leaders at all levels of the organization. We want to encourage leadership everywhere. So one of the things that we did at Comcast was we focused on having people who were creating guilds, and those people were not necessarily subject matter experts, but had an interest in things that were happening within their organization at a certain within it with a certain purview. So, for instance, we had a UI guild that was made up of the people who were working on user interface elements, and they would meet and talk through everything and try to figure out what it was that they could do to improve being UI developers over the course of their projects. And so that was one of those examples of leadership that we had at the sort of the worker bee level. And while you expect it higher up, we do really want to encourage it at all levels of the organization. So, how do we Kanban? Well, the first thing you want to do is you want to visualize the work and the workflow. So what I've got here is a representation of a beaver, or a big visual information radiator, BVIR, and it allows us to see all the work that's in progress and up for progress, up to be done, and that's already been done. And it allows us to see all the work within the workflow in any given state. The second thing we want to do is you want to limit our work in progress. So we really want to focus on trying to keep our work in progress small and focused so that we can pull work through the system. Kanban is a pull system. We pull work from upstream and then deliver it downstream, and in a way that the downstream can take it. So we want to make sure that we're balancing that, and WIP is one of those things that we can do. Work in progress, or WIP, is how we can do that. The third thing is this concept of Kaizen, which is Japanese for continuous improvement. But unfortunately, the term continuous improvement doesn't really give it the oomph that you would get out of the Japanese interpretation of it, which really is almost not a critical desire, but it is a strong push and almost needs to be improving on a regular basis. So Kaizen, what we try to do there is just really focus on trying to find improvements that we can make in the process at any given point during the process. Fourth thing we want to do is manage our flow. So much like a dam does with a river, and making sure that we're not getting too much on the upstream side and we're having just enough on the downstream side. You want to manage your flow. So WIP is one of the ways that we can do that, but overall we want to look at the entire flow and make sure that work is flowing through properly. If we have systems downstream that are starving because of a lack of deliverables, we need to make sure we're trying to manage that. And then the fifth thing is trying to make sure that all of these things are explicit, that everyone's aware of why we're doing what we're doing, that everyone's bought into it. So making all of this stuff explicit and very clear, which your beaver will help you do. You want to make sure that everything is explicit. So a good example of how to do this is what I talked about earlier, this Kanban board. So this is a Kanban board that I actually use for my personal work. I'm a hobby game developer in my spare time. I own my own company, Autobahn Productions. And my daughter came up with an idea for a game for cats and dogs as secret agents trying to save the world. And so I decided to use a Kanban board to track all the work that I've got to do for that. And what I have here is one item in progress. What I have learned is that my personal WIP limit is 1. If I have more than one item in progress, then I'm going to spend an awful lot of time context switching between them. I'll work a little bit on this item, and then I'll get stuck, and then I'll switch over to the other item and work on it a little bit and get stuck, and then I'll keep going back and forth and spend more time switching context between those two items than I will actually getting any work done. So I focus my effort on trying to get one thing, complete it, and move on. So when it's done, it's done. Everything that's going to happen in the development and testing and everything else occurs in my in progress column. And when I've completed all of that and it's ready to go, I move it to done and then pull the next item in from my ready to pull. So what do we track when we're talking about Kanban? Well, there's two things. One is we track the work that's coming in, the slope of that work. As if it's too high or too low, then that can impact our work in and work out. We track our work out. How much are we getting done over time? Our WIP is the difference between the work that's coming in and the work that's out. So that tells us how much work is in progress. And our lead time is the time that is from when the item comes into the system until the item is delivered, is to completed, it is done. So that tells us how long a work request takes us to do. Now, we also sometimes do a cycle time, which is the actual time the team is actively working on it until it is delivered. So sometimes what you have is that there's a lot of uh, work that's coming in that has to go through a grooming process, or it requires a lot of conversations in order to get it to a state where the team can begin to work on it. And so that all counts as part of your lead time. But your cycle time allows you to say, once the team gets work and they begin to work on it, how long does it take them to complete it? And sometimes that can show you where your team is going to be falling down a little bit, or where they're excelling. And if your cycle time and lead times are vastly different, then there's a disconnect between when work is coming in and when it's ready to be worked. And so that's usually a clue that you need to start working on trying to do some more grooming or collaboration with your customers. Also, if your work in is lower slope than your work out, then you're going to end up eventually starving. You're going to have less work. You're going to have an empty backlog at some point. The same thing as the converse is true. If your work in is too high of a slope versus your work out, then you're going to have a growing backlog. You may end up with a lot of items in your backlog that you will never be able to work on, because it's always going to get pushed out by new work that's coming in. That's higher priority. So definitely some things to keep aware of. Your workout slope will help you identify those areas where maybe you can add additional staff, or maybe you need to start taking a look at adding an additional team. Remember, when we scale, especially in Scrum, we scale by adding teams, not members to teams. So you may want to think about organizationally, would another team be able to help out with this? So we talked a little bit about Scrum and Kanban. So what's Scrumban? We take these two ideas and put them together. What do we get? Well, first thing is we keep our product vision. That still drives what we're going to build. We keep a product backlog. That is the list of items that we will be working on at some point. Our sprint backlog morphs slightly because it becomes our sort of ready to pull list. Those items are items that can be done by the team at any point. So if they're suddenly, if you've completed an item, then your ready to pull list is those items you can begin to pull in and work on immediately. And so that's what that star denotes. We do keep our daily cycle. Every day we get together, we walk the board, we talk about what we're working on, and again, it's a recommitment to the work that you're going to be doing today. But we replace our sprint cycle with our Kanban board. Our Kanban board drives our work, and so we work off of the board. And our daily sprint, our daily stand-up, is now focused on the board rather than on the sprint backlog, on the sprint work. But at the end of it, we're still trying to deliver product. We're still trying to deliver value to our customers. So that stays. So we're not looking at a gigantic change, but we are looking at maybe a little bit of a shift in terms of thought and process. So our case study here is Team Porlock, and just quick overview. Team Porlock had 6 people working on it. We had 2 primarily testers and 4 primarily developers. They've been doing Scrum for about a year, but have been struggling a bit with it. They were supporting several different products that were in production and had to actively support both maintenance upgrades as well as supporting production issues. And they still had to support any new business that came in. So any other new features that were going to be added to the platform, this team was responsible for doing. One of the challenges they faced was that they thought that they were spending too much time in meetings. The consistent complaint I heard was, "Oh, we spend so much time in meetings, and I can't get any work done. I really just need to be able to work on things and get stuff done." So, from their perspective, the meetings were preventing them from doing work. And we can argue the values there, but that was their perception as a challenge. They also thought that estimating story points was useless. They had no idea why we were doing it. And so we had actually instituted this concept of hackathons about once a quarter at Comcast. And during one of these hackathons, to sort of make a point, I wrote this little magic estimating 8-ball. And the goal here was that, and it was for Android and for iOS, and you just shake your device, and it would show up and say, "Oh, here's that's 8 points, or this is 5 points, or whatever." Um, and you could probably argue it was a little bit passive aggressive, but the whole point of it really was to show that it was starting a conversation about what does this mean, and we were actually able to finally have that conversation and understand and get everybody on the same page in terms of why are we doing estimating, what's the value there, but at least it was sort of it was a little goose on the team to get everybody on the same page. Um, so before we jump too far into how this applies to Team Porlock, let's take a step back and a little bit of a side and talk about Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He's a poet from the 18th century. Did a couple of pretty famous poems. One of them, "Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner," and this one, "Kubla Khan, or A Vision in a Dream," a fragment. And Kubla Khan actually is one of my favorite poems, but the story behind it was that he was having an opium-induced dream, woke from this dream with the story of Xanadu, that's Kubla Khan, fully formed in his head. And so he sat down and immediately began to write this out and got about 100 lines into it. And all of a sudden has a knock at the door, and it's this person from Porlock, which is a town in England. And they discuss business for about an hour, and he comes back to finish the poem and finds he can't remember a single thing. He remembers little scattered fragments and images, but nothing that he can put down on paper. So that's why it's a fragment. He was interrupted by this person from Porlock and was unable to complete his work. As this applies to Team Porlock, they were, much like Coleridge, interrupted by all of these other things that were going on, primarily production defects. They had a lot of things that were happening where they had to provide production support for systems that were having failures in the field, and supporting different aspects of the system. They had a lot of different products they were supporting, and so one product would have this problem and it would trigger into this product, and so there's a lot of connectedness, and they were the tier 3 support for these products, but they often got called in to help fix these things. So they had a lot of interruptions going on. The another challenge that we had was that this team often would have to split stories between sprints. So what was going on was that they would commit to work one sprint, and then something would happen that would prevent them from completing that work, and so we'd split the story. And you can do this in Rally. It's pretty easy. I'm sure version 1 is the same thing. But you can split the work and then move tasks along the chain. But every time that you do it, and especially in Rally, you have a system. It shows you, hey, this was unfinished. It prepends the word unfinished to your story title, and it prepends the word continued to the second story, the new subsequent story. And we had several stories that had been split multiple times. The worst offender was a 6-split story. It had continued in front of it, and it was just ridiculous. So the team, for a variety of reasons, and it's not necessarily a failure of the team, ended up with a lot of problems having to split stories from sprint to sprint. The another thing that we were having problems with was not really having knowledge sharing. So we had 2 primary developers who had been working with the system for a very long time, understood what was going on, were working very hard to support it, and had a lot of experience and understanding of the system, had written a lot of it. But we had new developers who were coming in, and those new developers weren't getting the same knowledge and experience, understanding of the systems the way the other 2 did. So it was partly the personalities of the people involved, but also just the kinds of systems that we were working with and the products we were working with wasn't making it very conducive to have that kind of knowledge sharing. So this team definitely struggled from that, and the new members were not as successful in coming up to speed on these products as we needed them to be. And then we had this concept where the developers really wanted to go into a cave and do their work and come back to us. So I actually had at one point one of the developers come to me and say, just tell me what needs to be done. I'll go away for 6 or 9 months and I'll come back with a product. And of course the answer was, no, we really can't do that. But that was his his desire. He really wanted to have that as a possibility. So, and as a developer, I've been there. I got into development because I wanted to be in a cave. I liked being able to kind of, just work on something heads down and get it done. But in Agile, we don't do that. We really try to focus on trying to get everything uh, visual, and open and transparent. That's one of the Agile tenets. And so, having a beaver, all these things, that helps us understand the overall state of a project. And the developers didn't want to do that. They wanted to go back into their caves. So you say, but this is really just a coaching thing. Since this is not a methodology problem, they're not struggling with Scrum. They need to work with them to get them to work better with Scrum. So I look at this as, you're right, it is a coaching issue. And the coaching thing here, I take an analogy, is from baseball. So let's say that you're a baseball coach and you have a player who's your second baseman, and he's just not working out. He can't turn double plays. He doesn't know which side of the side of the base to stand on during particular plays. He's just struggling. So he may not work well on second base, but he might work really well as a first baseman or as a third baseman. Maybe you need to just move him around, try a different position for him. So as an Agile coach, I might say, okay, well, this team may not be working very well with Scrum base, but they might work really well on Scrumban base. So let's maybe try a different thing. This really gives you an opportunity to have Scrumban as a tool in your toolbox to work with your team and try to figure something out. Maybe your team can move from being an okay team using Scrum to being a top performing team using Scrumban. So when we look at our transition metrics from before the transition, you can see some of these splits I was talking about. In month 5 we had 8 stories that were split. So we just had a real struggle with some of these things during this process, before this process came around. When we look at our velocity and our stories accepted, averaged over the course of the month, our velocity began to drop in the months leading up to our transition. We were definitely seeing some problems where the team wasn't committing to as much work, wasn't completing as much work as it had been in months prior. And so much so that in month 5, that's when we really began to look at maybe a different idea would be better here. And then when we look at the stories accepted, again, it's sort of spotty all over the place, but definitely some struggles there with the stories and just not getting them accepted. Now, one thing I did do for this particular slide was I didn't count any stories that were accepted after the sprint ended. So while there were some stories that we completed after the fact, I didn't include those because those were not actually completed as part of the sprint. And we took a look at the Kanban metrics before we began this transition, and we said, where are we going with this? And so you look at this, you see that our cycle time was going up. We were definitely seeing increasing cycle times. The team is spending more time working on these stories, and they weren't bigger stories. They were just ending up spending more time on them. And again, for a variety of reasons. Our lead time also was going up, and that was definitely concerning because we had some product commitments that we were trying to meet. And if that lead time continued to go up, then we were going to be less able to meet those requirements, those needs from the product. Okay, so we came across with a proposal to talk to Team Porlock about going to Scrumban. And the proposal was, let's start off with 3 months. And at the end of 3 months, we'll decide whether we're going to persevere and continue on with Scrumban or pivot to something else. The nice thing about the 3 months was that it aligned with the end of the year. And so it allowed us at the end of the year to, sort of finish everything off with the Scrumban. And then when we came back after the holidays, say, all right, how are we doing? Are we ready to go on with something else? So it was a good milestone for us to shoot for, but allowed us to really to focus our efforts on just a short period of time to see how it was going to benefit us. We were going to have fewer meetings. The idea behind this was simply to address that concern the team had. So what we did is we went ahead and we kept our stand-ups, daily stand-ups. And so every day we would stand up and walk the board and get updates, answer 3 questions about everything that's on the board. And then we would keep our retrospectives. So every 2 weeks we would get together, talk about how are things going, even if all we did was go through the basic 3 questions of what went well, what didn't go well, and then come up with an action plan of what are we going to do next. We at least had that cadence, and we persisted that. We also kept sprint reviews. There's actually an organizational element to this where we had instituted reviews every 2 weeks. Everybody would get together, all the teams across our entire development organization would get together and present what they had done over the last 2 weeks, with a focus on what they had done that could then benefit other teams. So things that were, we built this infrastructure using Hudson, and so you guys can use this, or hey, we came up with this great idea for using Maven to do X, Y, and Z, and you guys can leverage that. So we tried to make it that keep within that context, but we did want to make sure that we were having this review cycle every 2 weeks, retrospective cycle every 2 weeks to keep that window down, and also daily stand-ups. We did get rid of sprint planning entirely, so we didn't do any sprint planning, but we did persist backlog grooming at some level, which was we had a certain number of stories that were marked as ready to pull. So they were those stories that once an item was completed, we could simply pull the next item in from ready to pull and do our in progress column and begin working on it. So we had a list of stories there. And whenever that got too low, we would go through and do a backlog grooming session with our product owner, go through, figure out what was there, and groom the items well enough that they can be moved into our ready to pull category from our backlog. Also, whenever things came in that were higher priority for the business, we would go through and we would backlog groom those. So it was more of an on-demand kind of backlog grooming session, but it really enabled the team to focus on the work and then only grooming when necessary. We wanted to keep our multitasking down, keeping our work in progress limit low, so that we weren't trying to do multiple things and we weren't going to be killing ourselves with a lot of work in progress. One of the challenges I think most Scrum teams face is that a lot of their work goes into progress as soon as they start the sprint, because everybody sort of dives in and just starts working on things. And we were seeing that as well, but we wanted to make sure that that WIP limit was reasonable so that everybody was doing something and focusing on getting the work in, worked on, completed, and then moved out. So we tried to consciously track our WIP limits. We also talked about doing swim lanes. So what we did here was that we decided that we were going to create a swim lane specifically for production issues. And so it was the top of our board, and it was the first line of on the Kanban board, and it had production issues. So anything that came in that was a production issue got put in right there at the top, and that was what we worked on. Then we had different swim lanes for different products, because sometimes different people were working on different products, and so we had different swim lanes for those, and it allowed us to have WIP limits for each individual product, so that you wouldn't say, well, for product X we're going to have 8 stories in progress out of our 10-story WIP limit. Instead, we said, well, we're only going to allow 2 stories to be in progress for that particular product at any given time. And then overall, we can have a WIP limit for the entire board. So that really let us fine-grain control some of those individual products as well as the overall team dynamics. One of the strengths that the team had that was very beneficial was they already had some experience doing decomposition. So they were already able to take stories that were parent stories and break them into child stories that allowed them to work on smaller chunks of work. That was one of the things that they had been working on as part of Scrum, and they were actually pretty good at it. The other thing that really worked in their favor was they wanted to be a winning team. They had a reputation as kind of some screw-ups and not being very committed to the methodology or the work or the business, and they really wanted to change that. They were very committed to trying to modify that perception within the organization, and they wanted to win. So this was something that we could really definitely leverage from a coaching perspective. One of the challenges that we faced, though, was an awful lot of blocked work. So we had a lot of things that were going on where we were relying on third parties to deliver things for us, either environment setup or maintenances that had to happen, or deliverables from other teams, that kind of thing. And we would actually, during Scrum, say, well, during our planning, we'll say we need to get this done by this team, and we'll give them this amount of time, which they've asked for. We'll give them some buffer, and then we will begin to work on it. And then invariably, those teams would use up all the time that they had requested plus the buffer, plus some of the time that we were actually supposed to be working on our side of it. So it ended up being really challenging, and we ended up having to block a lot of work because of that kind of a model. We also would have a lot of things in progress. Like a lot of Scrum teams, as soon as the sprint started, we would put everything into progress, and the team would pretty much go over the WIP limit for the sprint, and so we had to try to work on that. And then this one, of course, is when you're talking about decomposing stories, which the team had experience with and good experience with. Uh, there was still a very strong inclination to split things up by layers. So I want to do the UI layer, and then someone else is going to do the middle tier, and someone else is going to do the back end, and someone else is going to write some DB scripts, and all these things will work together. And yes, you're right. And the challenge, of course, for any team that's adopting agile processes, especially ones that use stories, is composing into vertical slices. And what you end up with is going against many years of education and training and experience of decomposing work that way, and now saying you need to kind of take this from this the layer approach that you've got, and turn it on its head and do it by vertical slices. And a lot of engineers have challenges with that. I think a lot of product owners do as well. And that's one of the challenges this team most definitely faced. When we begin to look, though, after our transition, in the 6 months following the transition, and we look at our story splits, though, you can see that, well, we started off, still splitting some stories because we had taken on work that was too big, or that we had to deliver part of now and then finish up later on. We still saw significantly fewer stories being split after the transition to Scrumban than we were before. That 2 week time box was working against us in a lot of ways, that moving into a Scrumban model where we could keep things in progress for a little bit longer allowed us to not have to split those stories on a regular basis. We look at velocity comparison. When we immediately switched over to Scrumban, we were definitely having some problems with our velocity. We were seeing it drop down a bit after 3 months. And it was actually mirroring the first 3 months that we were doing it for pre-transition. But the team decided after 3 months to say, you know what, this is working okay. Let's keep trying it. And so we kept at it. And then, of course, you can see, months 4, 5, and 6, we ended up doing much better velocity-wise than we had done in the 3 months prior. So the team, once they got familiar with the process, began to make some positive changes and ended up doing a much better job than they had before. And same thing with stories. We were accepting more stories. Now, again, this is a little bit of apples and oranges in terms of we were only talking about stories that were accepted during the sprint versus not. But even if I accounted for the stories that were accepted after the sprint, we were accepting more stories as part of Scrumban per month than we were in Scrum. So even though those numbers that you see there, 3 stories in month 5, we only had 5 stories total for month 5 that were accepted, even including those that were outside of the sprint, whereas we had 8 by the time we were doing Scrumban. And if we look at our combined metrics for cycle time and lead time, you can look at it and say our pre-cycle time and lead times were pretty high in terms of number of days. And for our post-transition metrics, we began to see much better improvements. We definitely had a light month in month 2, but as we continued this process, the team got better, and it was becoming more predictable. And that's one of the major goals of Agile, is making these things more predictable. And by making it transparent, you begin to have a clearer idea of where you are, where you're going, and how you're going to get there. And so by sort of beginning to have that level off of lead time and cycle time for post-transition, the team was definitely getting better at delivering on those promises that we were making. So overall, our results, a little bit less work in progress. The team picked some WIP limits, and we were able to keep to those. And we were doing fewer things at the same time than we were before transition. Less story splitting. We definitely saw less need and better benefits out of having that those stories stay in that active state a little bit longer. More work was getting done. In that bottom left, we definitely had more work getting completed. Our cycle time was lower. We began to see those things, and I would say in general morale improved. The team wasn't still quite meeting their goals for their perceived reputation within the organization, but they definitely weren't the screw ups that they thought they were. And I'd say that they began to see that this is beginning to work for them, and they're beginning to see some benefits. Things that weren't quite as successful, still a lot of blocked work. We did go over WIP a few times because of blocked work, but it was a very conscious decision to do that. We took a look at it and say, are we going to do this or not? During our meeting with our product owner right there, the whole team decided, yes, we're going to do this because of X, and everybody was signed on with that. It was very clear for everybody what was going on, and we definitely still, though, with those third parties, had a lot of problems with that work getting blocked. We still were seeing some problems around knowledge transfer. And I think one of the things we needed to do there, and we didn't, was really push more towards a collaborative engineering approach. So, extreme programming recommends doing pair programming. It doesn't recommend it, mandates doing pair programming. And we should have pushed more for, well, let's not do pair programming, although that was an option. The resistance factor there, I think, would have been extremely high. Rather, let's maybe get some people together and say, okay, for a few hours today, why don't person A and person B, why don't you guys work together on this story, and then let's get that done. And that would have helped with that knowledge transfer. And the last thing that we were really seeing a lot of was interruptions still. We were planning for it. We did have that extra swim lane just for those production issues, but they were still coming in fast and furious. And the team was definitely distracted by those. They had to do that context switching to go to that production issue and then come back. So there definitely was some lost productivity there. But I think overall, because it was visible to everybody what was going on, and it wasn't just simply missed commitments during a sprint, it was a lot clearer about why things were happening, but it was still an issue that we had to try to address. So let's say that you've seen this presentation and you're thinking to yourself, gee, this sounds like a really good tool. I would like to have this in my toolbox. How would I go about that? So let's talk about adopting Scrumban and how you can take this concept for your team and take this back to your team so that you can begin to adopt these things. So first things I would ask, though, is, let's ask your team some questions before you begin to look at Scrumban as a viable methodology for you to adopt. So the first thing is, are you getting interrupted a lot? Are you Coleridge and you've got a lot of work going on, and all of a sudden you can't do a single thing about it because somebody shows up at your doorstep? Is this a continuing problem? Do you have a lot of these issues? Time boxes, the second thing up there. Do time boxes work for you, or are they inhibiting your team? Do you find that your metrics look more like the second set of metrics we talked about earlier, where you've got that hockey stick for accepted stories? Is your team putting everything into progress and then struggling to meet the end of the sprint deadlines? That can be really telling for you. Does your team have a lot of work that's being blocked? This can be a challenge. You can still base a lot of your in progress and ready to pull items upon deliverables from other teams, and so you can end up with items staying inside your ready to pull that are predicated upon someone else delivering something to you, which can increase your lead times. But if your cycle times are still low, then at least you know that your team is effective in delivering value, even if the lead times are still long. And then, do you have too much work in progress? Is this something that your team is effectively managing, or are you struggling with everything going into progress and then having problems delivering at the end of the sprint? So take a look at adopting Scrumban. First off, where are you? What does your organization look like? What does your team look like? How open are they to adopting something else? How open is your organization to adopting something else? Scrumban operates a little bit differently, and so the metrics that we're looking at from Scrumban can sometimes conflict with what other parts of the organization are expecting or are used to seeing. So you need to figure out, where are you and where is your organization before you begin to adopt Scrumban. But let's say that your team, you say, I can handle the organizational issues because there are none, or you're that politic and able to do that, um, and you can handle the metrics. So how do you go ahead and adopt? Well, first things I recommend is visualize your work, both the workflow, from everything that you've got from going from to do all the way through you're done, and structuring your columns in such a way that it's very easy to see where work is at any given point during the process, and then implement that beaver. Get that big visual information radiator up on a wall or on a TV or whatever it is that you can do. At Comcast, we were very thankful that we had televisions all over the place that we could use for our beavers, and we put them on rolling carts, and we could move them around, and so they were very. You could swap it out and make it whatever you wanted to at any given time. We used Rally. It was very easy to do these kinds of things. I've also seen it done with putting something on the side of a wall and having all the columns laid out and just having everything up there. But make it visual, make it in your space so that everybody can see it all the time and knows exactly where everything is. Second thing, really work on that WIP limit. Try to keep that in progress down to something that your team can handle. If your team is like me and can only handle one thing at a time, great. Set a WIP limit of one. The standard rule of thumb for any team is setting your WIP limit initially to be n minus one, where n is the number of people on the team, and you can add in Scrum Master and Product Owner if you want to, or Kanban Sensei, depending on what you want your title to be, or you can just leave it to the delivery team itself, all the developers and testers and everything. Up to you, but start off with like n minus one, and then see where that goes, because that's a really good opportunity. You're going to be almost forcing people to work together to get things completed, which may help move things along and establish that flow that you're looking for. The next thing, manage your flow. Really go back and look and try to figure out how the work is flowing through the system. Are we seeing starvation in some areas? Are we seeing overflow in others? Figure out what's appropriate WIP limits. What are your appropriate exit and entry criteria? Is work flowing down too quickly? Is it flowing down too slowly? And then find the ways to massage that process to make that flow much smoother and cleaner. And the last thing, it's not generally needed, and not recommended necessarily, but I think it certainly is, which is retrospectives. Look back. Take a look in the rearview mirror. Find out where you've been, where you're going, how you're getting there. Again, I focus on every 2 weeks. I think it's a great cadence for retrospectives. So focus on that. Every 2 weeks, get together. How are we doing? Is this working for us? Is this not working for us? What's working? What do we need to improve upon? There's a lot of different things you can do to make retrospectives interesting and engaging. Different formats for it. I recommend doing all of them. Take a look at as many as you can. There's an awful lot of options out there, and they'll help keep your team engaged. They'll help keep your team from getting bored and checking out during retrospective. Retrospective, in part of that inspect adapt cycle, is one of the most important things that we do as part of Agile. But there are some cautions. So what are those cautions? Don't turn your Kanban flow, your Scrumban flow, into mini waterfall. Don't go through and say, oh, well, here's a backlog and architecture, design, and analysis, and development, and testing, and load and preview. No, try to keep it as simple as you can, but be very explicit about your exit and entry criteria. What does it take to move something from one state to another? And I recommend very strongly that you keep it as simple as I've got my Kanban board, which is, here's my to-do, here's my ready to pull, here's my in progress, here's my done. That's it. Sometimes you need to add a little bit extra from a state tracking perspective, depending on how you are managing your environments, everything else like that. Or if you're not getting enough granularity of where something is in a process, if something is going to take a very long time. Say your in progress is development and test, which is all happening simultaneously, but you've also got to put it into a QA environment to have them validate everything against your automated scripts so that you can then promote it up to a different environment. That's okay. Make sure, but you want to, again, this all goes back to managing flow. It's all about what makes sense to track, what makes sense to not track, what can be combined to try to focus the team on completing work and moving value through the system, pulling value through the system. But making sure that your exit and entry criteria are explicit and visible really helps with understanding what's going on with the columns. How does something move from ready to pull to in progress? What has to be done? Does it have to be tasked? Does it have to be assigned owners? Does it have to have automation set up around it? Does it have to have a certain environment established? All those kinds of things so that you're not going to be pulling work in that you're going to immediately block or not be able to work. So make sure that you're meeting those exit entry criteria. And then try to avoid having a dev and then a test state. What you want to make sure that your developers, especially, but your team is aware of, is that we succeed or fail as a team. There's no developers and testers, and we don't throw it over the wall to our test team and have them run, go through all the requirements documents and then create automated tests off of that. The team should be working together to try to build that infrastructure. So if you can avoid having a separate test state for stories, then you can avoid having to go back upstream if you have additional development that has to happen. So the idea here is just really try to keep that together as one cohesive piece so that all the things that have to happen in order for a story to be accepted can happen in one phase. So, like I said, sometimes you're talking about like a dev environment, test environment, that's fine, but you don't want to call those out necessarily as separate columns, but you do want to have that as all part of one state that item, the work item can be in, so that the team can move that from we are done working on this thing to the next state. And that will really help with your flows. So getting help. Let's say that you're adopting the Scrum, you want to adopt Scrumban and you have some questions, or you are adopting it and you're having some problems. Well, first thing, there's some help out there. There are obviously books on Scrumban. There's a new one coming out. I just found out about it at Mile High Agile last week, which is great. There's also coaching. Companies like mine offer coaching and training and consulting. There's several other companies out there that do the same thing. Definitely, see what you can do to get with somebody who's done this before and has the experience and can help you be successful with your transition. Also, free of charge is the Agile Denver Kanban SIG meetup. It's the second Thursday of every month, well, almost every month, and a group of like-minded individuals get together with varying degrees of Kanban experience, and we get together and talk about things. Review very specific deep dive topics, and then we have sometimes a lean coffee kind of experience where we can put up different ideas and then people can vote on them, and then we'll talk about the most popular ideas for that week. But it's also an opportunity to connect and network with people who are doing this or who have done this and have an interest in talking about it. So I strongly recommend it. The Kanban SIG, great group of people, a lot of them very experienced, and they have a lot of capacity to help out, and they have a lot of willingness to help out. So hit them up. But remember, Scrumban is, it's white gold or it's blue black. It's another tool in your toolbox. It's another way of looking at your team, seeing if maybe, like I said, they don't work so well on Scrum base, but they do work on Scrumban base. Great, make that move. And help your team understand the benefits that they can achieve from this. It's up to you as the coach to figure out, is this the right move for your team or not? But once you do, sometimes you'll see that dress as a different color and your team through a different perspective. Quick plug, or small plug rather, there is an Agile book club that I started, but I definitely encourage everybody to come and attend it. Our next meeting is Tuesday, May 19th at 6 o'clock. It's going to be the Sheridan Library in Denver. There's going to be details on meetup.com under the Agile Denver group, so definitely check that up. It's also Agile Denver group on meetup.com is where the Kanban SIG information is. There's also a Scrum Master Guild that meets. Again, you can get that information on meetup.com under Agile Denver. So thank you very much for watching my presentation. I appreciate it. I hope that you got something out of this and that it definitely is firing some neurons for you, and you're feeling that you've got an opportunity here to maybe take a fresh look at a team that may be underperforming. If you have any questions or anything, you can hit me up. I'm Bill at artemisagile.com, website www.artemisagile.com, and I'm on Twitter at Artemis Agile. I do post up some information on classes and that kind of thing. My website, I do post information about topics I'm talking about, like Scrumban or retrospectives and product owner proxies, all those kinds of things. I do typically tackle some interesting topics up there. I welcome feedback and welcome your participation. And hopefully I've answered some questions. If I haven't, please hit me up via email or in the comment section and we will see what we can do. Thank you so much. I appreciate it and have an awesome day.